our operating system for humans is essentially an emotional one. And the ruling emotion is fear.
The idea that you can censor misinformation is a relic of the 20th century. You can't censor an avalanche. If you try to suppress a narrative, it's going to leak out. And as soon as a little bit of it leaks out, the very fact that it was suppressed is going to make it appealing to everybody else. And so I think the biggest impact of AI with regards to truth is going to be to flood the internet with false information. You just completely overwhelm the internet with false narratives in order to demoralize people, because if everything's false, then they just don't know what to believe. So our children will grow up to basically be accustomed to seeing so much misinformation that they won't trust what they see. We are all going to have to just do our own research.
Who are people attracted to? They're attracted to people who speak with certainty.
The way I see it is that certainty is the death of thought.
I can tell you these simple truths, which of course aren't truths at all.
Be humble and be curious.
Well, hello everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops. I am literally one of the luckiest guys on the planet because I get to talk to some of the smartest, most switched on people in the world just because I have this podcast. It's like magic. Today, I have Gurwinder Bhogal, who is sort of the king of the ultimate Megathreads on Twitter. I love all of them. I was just looking, Gurwinder G, as you say, others often call you. I saw that you had a Twitter thread that had 1.7 million views and like over 10,000 likes. Tell me your secret, because I write threads and like 4 likes. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there is a secret. I mean, I did think that I had it sort of locked down because the first few ones I did, I got like 40,000, 50,000 likes, and that was purely by chance. I had no sort of anticipation that this was going to blow up so much. But it was really just, I think it was quite new, but because I started doing it in 2020, I started doing these mega threads of concepts, and they were very popular back then. Since then, they're not as popular as they were, I think, because a lot of other people are doing it now as well. And I think the novelty factor really sort of, ensured that a lot of people really wanted to read them. But yeah, I think there's an appetite for people to sort of just understand the world better, really, and particularly the digital age, because a lot of my mega threads deal with the sort of intersection of technology and psychology and how sort of, social media, for instance, is influencing society and things like that. And I think that's a very hot topic at the moment.
Very, very hot. And what I did was go back through all of your threads. I loved them all when I read them the first time, and I loved them even more, actually, in the context of this interview. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to start out with that first famous one you did in February 2020. I think you called it 40 Powerful Concepts. And I thought that it would be fun to talk about some of them. Because I agree with you that people are really enamored of learning these kinds of things. And I mean, the proof's in the pudding. You get all these likes, you get the number of views you get. So I think it's an incredibly valuable thing you're doing. And the first one I wanted to talk about was the Woozle effect. I'm a fan of Winnie the Pooh. And of course, that was one of their famous little hunting trips where they would say, "Beware the heffalumps and woozles." But you reframe it as something that I'm really interested in because I've experienced it firsthand. And basically, it's this idea that somebody writes an article and asserts something without any evidence at all, and then other people like what has been asserted in that article, and they start quoting the person from that article, and so on, until it builds up this huge body of so-called proof that, of course, this is a commonly accepted fact. The reason I'm so fascinated by this was a long time ago, there was this huge jump in interest in homelessness in the United States. And it was seen to be this massive, massive problem. in the 80s. And of course, it is a massive problem. However, I started thinking, I wonder where they get this number from. Because it was, I think at the time, this from memory, I think it was like claiming that there were 25 million people in America who were homeless or otherwise unhoused. And so I'm a research junkie, and so I went down the thread, and I kept going, kept going, kept going until I found the original piece that got it all started, and it was simply an assertion from a high schooler writing an essay about the potential problems of homelessness. No citations, just an assertion. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the big problems of the digital age because obviously we live in a networked world now. There's chains of transmission of information, and what this means is that information gets repeated often. You'll get some. It could be take the form of any form. It could be a retweet on Twitter, or it could be somebody uses another information source as a citation, as a sort of as a research source, and I think, you see it everywhere. I mean, some of the examples that have sort of stuck in my mind would be the Iraq War, would be there was this claim that was very, very popular at one point, which was that 1 million people had died in Iraq as a result of the Iraq War. And this was everywhere. I mean, this was, in very prestigious journals and magazines. It was in the Guardian and the New York Times. And everybody thought, oh my God, 1 million people have been killed by the US and allies in bombing. And I actually thought this was a bit of a strange. I thought it just sounded too much to me. I thought 1 million people. I mean, it just doesn't seem right to me. It just didn't seem, And so I basically did a bit of background sort of research. I did a bit of digging, and I followed the sort of the chain of citations, and I realized it was basically down to some kind of throwaway claim in a Lancet article, which was basically, it was just an estimate. That's all it was. And there was no research behind it. There was no, on the ground sort of actual hard journalism or anything like that. It was literally just some guy just estimated it just off the top of his head. And he just put it as a throwaway comment in a Lancet article. And then because it was in the Lancet, all these other journals just suddenly started citing it as a fact. And then as it sort of got cited, it gained credibility and eventually it became the sort of official statistic. So it's quite dangerous because I think it can really skew a person's understanding of the world. I mean, that wasn't the only sort of instance of this happening during the Iraq War. Also, there was the 45-minute claim as well, which was that Saddam Hussein could ready a sort of a chemical attack within 45 minutes. And this was also something that was just thrown out there just as a sort of speculative point. And it eventually became the truth because it was cited so many times. And you see it on Wikipedia all of the time. I don't trust Wikipedia at all now. I used to think that Wikipedia was one of the best information sources because anybody could edit it. But the problem is that that's not actually true. There's basically there's a kind of gatekeeping on Wikipedia edits, and only certain forms of information, only certain journals and magazines are allowed, and they all tend to have a certain political persuasion. And you see that there's always a lot of claims on Wikipedia, which when you actually follow the chain of citations, they just turn out to just be nonsense, they rest on a speculative point. A lot of the stuff that I've been reading lately, for instance, nowadays you've got stuff like implicit association tests, which are sort of stated if you go on Wikipedia, you'll see a lot of stuff there about how they can be used to measure a person's implicit bias, how racist they are, and how prejudiced they are. In reality, implicit association tests are about as accurate as lie detector tests, which is to say, not accurate at all.
At all.
You could give the same person 2 IATs within a week, and you'd get completely different results. But the thing is, if you go on Wikipedia, that's not really mentioned very much. I don't know if it's mentioned at all, but you'll see that they use it. It will basically say that these are used to measure a person's implicit bias. Then you actually follow the citations, and you end up at activism. Basically, there's no real research there. It's just some activist, a diversity and equity and inclusion specialist or whatever, is basically just saying that you can determine how racist someone is by one of these tests. So this is just one example, but I mean, Wikipedia is filled with it. And it's one reason why I actually think Wikipedia is probably the world's largest source of misinformation. But it's ignored. It's ignored. I mean, governments and businesses and things don't seem to care very much about Wikipedia. It seems to always, whenever they're talking about misinformation, they tend to think of stuff that's on the fringes, stuff on the far right, occasionally stuff on the far left, but it's mainly stuff on the far right that is labeled misinformation. Whereas mainstream sources of misinformation, like Wikipedia, tend to be overlooked because they tend to gel with the current consensus. But this is the problem of the Woozle effect, is that you can't rely on citations because you can't really trust citations in a networked age, because citations have citations, which have citations, which have citations. So you always have to do the research. You always got to look at, if there's a claim that seems too strange to be true, always check the citation and read it and see where the original source of that information is from. Because the amount of times that I've just found information to not reflect what is actually being cited, it's too much to count.
Could not agree with you more. One of the core principles of Propaganda 101 is repetition, repetition, repetition. And it hijacks our human OS, our human operating system, because that was the way that most of over evolution that we learned, right? We learned by copying, we learned by repeating, repeating, repeating. And so it's right there in our base code to, oh, well, I've seen it everywhere, it must be true. There's so many threads to pull on here. The one that I'm interested in is, how do you think AI will impact this? One of the uses, I think, for AI, of what I would call neutral AI, is you could set AI loose on, let's say, every published scientific study, right? And say, okay, the objective function we're going to maximize for, is this bullshit or not? and my guess would be that we'd probably find more than 20%, maybe, that was like outright fraudulent. I think of Ansel Keys and his fraudulent research at the University of Minnesota, but there's tons of examples. Do you think that a neutral AI could help us fact check this type of thing?
I don't think so, because I've been experimenting with AI. I think AI is probably going to increase the amount of misinformation in the world rather than reduce it, because I think it's very easy to leverage AI to create false narratives, but it's quite difficult to leverage AI to destroy those narratives. And I mean, we live in an age now where sort of falsehood is not just something that it's not just like, disinformation is not just false narratives. It's basically something called fire hosing, which is a new form of disinformation, which is where you just completely overwhelm the internet with false narratives in order to demoralize people, because if everything's false, then they just don't know what to believe. And so this is something that I fear is going to be a big sort of implication of AI. I think because AI can sort of do the work of 1,000 troll farms to just completely flood the internet with misinformation, I think this is going to be probably the biggest impact of AI with regards to falsehood. And I mean, I've actually been using certain AI apps that purport to be able to distinguish between human generated text and AI generated text. And unfortunately, they're very unreliable. I mean, pretty much every single one that I've used has accused me of being an AI when I uploaded my work to it. Because I basically had a few essays that I wrote in 2017, and I uploaded them into these websites, and they ran a few programs. They checked the perplexity of the text, and they just assumed that basically was written by an AI. I've looked at some of the techniques that people believe that they might be able to determine what's true or not. One of them is a stochastic method, where they basically check the statistical makeup of the letters in the sentence using things like Zipf's law. But those have already been gamed. They can be gamed quite easily, because the problem with a lot of these AIs that purport to distinguish between human and AI generated text is that they rely on metrics that are very easily gamed, things like perplexity. So perplexity is a measure of how indicative the output is of the input. So if you have a training data which consists of lots of letters beginning with I, and then basically perplexity would measure the proportion of letters in the output the output sentences which begin with I compared to the input. But that could be easily gamed, because all it takes is just somebody to write like an AI, which is essentially saying all it takes is for a human to write like the average human, because these language models, these large language models, are essentially writing like the average human. They're writing like the average writer is probably more accurate. And so if you just write like the average writer, you can game the algorithm on that front. There are probably, I've heard other people suggest techniques like putting information on the chain, on blockchain, which I suppose could work. I don't really know very much about blockchain technology, so I wouldn't be able to determine whether that could work or not, but that's another option that's been thrown out there. But aside from those two methods, I mean, there's something, quantum cryptography could perhaps be something down the line, but again, I don't know much about that. From what I know is AI is not very well equipped to distinguish between human and AI generated text, because of the very fact that AI is so good at mimicking human text. It essentially recycles human text, and that's what makes it so hard to distinguish between the two. And so I think the biggest impact of AI with regards to truth is going to be to flood the internet with false information. I think that it's going to be leveraged by governments and by activists to create huge amounts of misinformation. But I actually think this is a good thing. I don't think this is a bad thing at all. And I mean, I'll probably have to go on another tangent to explain this. I don't know if you want me to, but
please do.
Yeah. So I think that the idea that you can censor misinformation is a relic of the 20th century. I don't think it works in the 21st century. It only worked when narratives were centralized, because then you could nip it in the bud. You could basically cut it off at the source and nobody would know about it. But when you try to apply this 20th century technique to 21st century technology, you end up with things like the Streisand effect. So if you try to suppress a narrative, what happens is, because you can't completely suppress it due to the network nature of the world in which we live, it's going to leak out. And as soon as a little bit of it leaks out, the very fact that it was suppressed is going to make it appealing to everybody else. Everybody's going to want to know what was suppressed. And so it will incite people to find out more. It will incite their curiosity, and eventually it will blow up and it will go viral. So it usually backfires. And now you have a completely different problem, which is that the entire internet is going to be flooded essentially with falsehoods. I mean, you're just going to have AI pumping this stuff out. It's already happening. I mean, if you've seen on Twitter, there was a lot of photos of Trump being arrested and things like that. There's loads of these fake images going around. So this stuff's going to be all over social media, and it can't be censored. You can't censor such a huge amount. You can't censor an avalanche, basically. If this is going to be an avalanche of misinformation. But I think this is good, and the reason I think it's good is because there's only one way we can find truth in such a world, in a world that's teeming in misinformation, and that is to become acclimatized to a world that's filled with lies, to be exposed to lies so often that we stop trusting what we are seeing. Now, I like to draw an analogy with King Mithridates, he was king. He was a Persian king of Pontus in the ancient world, and he was enemies with the Romans, and he feared that Roman agent was going to poison him because his father had been poisoned. So what he did is he had his servants cultivate a garden of toxins, of poisons. Every known poison that from all over the world he had brought to his garden and planted in his garden. So he basically had a garden filled with poisons. And each day he would create a drink which consisted of a tiny dose of each of the poisons from his garden. And he did this every single day to cultivate immunity. It was something known as hormesis, where you expose yourself to small amounts of a stressor over a long period of time and gradually build a community. And according to, I don't know if this is history or if it's legend, because some say it is and some say it isn't, but apparently when the Romans did invade and when they destroyed his kingdom, he tried to commit suicide when the Romans were coming for him by drinking poison, but the poison had no effect on him. So he found himself in a bit of an awkward position, and he had to get his bodyguard to kill him with a sword. But that's the general idea that I think we need to take towards misinformation, is we need to cultivate a kind of garden of Mithridates in which we slowly and gradually expose ourselves day by day to just the information landscape. We don't need to do anything. We just need to sort of see the information as it is, uncensored. And because there's going to be so much falsehoods online, we will grow up to be, at least our children will grow up to basically be accustomed to seeing so much misinformation that they won't trust what they see. And this sort of speaks to an idea that was originally thought of by the computer scientist Matt Blaze in the 1990s. He had this idea of this thing called it was called the Encyclopedia Disinformatica. And it was basically like a kind of Wikipedia. But what it was is that precisely 50% of it was true and 50% of it was false. And the purpose behind it is that it's supposed to encourage you to do your own research, because you don't know what's true and what's not. So you go onto this kind of this sort of misinformation sort of extravaganza, and you kind of read, you might read about history, you might read about the Second World War, for instance, and it will give you precisely half of the truth. But for you to actually determine what half is true and what half is not, you actually have to do your own research. So it's an idea that basically stokes your curiosity and gets you to do your own research. And that's essentially what I think AI is going to turn the internet into. It's going to turn it into a giant Encyclopedia Disinformatica. And we are all going to have to just do our own research. We're going to have to use the internet actively rather than passively. We can no longer trust anything we see online. We're going to have to, we will have to be the fact checkers ourselves. And I think that that's a good thing, because it will make us more robust at determining truth. Whereas if we were to live in a world where everything was censored, it would be like being in a quarantined environment. If somebody if they live their whole lives in a quarantined environment, then their immune system doesn't ever get exposed to pathogens, and so it weakens. And so when they are finally released into the wider world, they get ill and they succumb to their illness. So this is a way of, I suppose, strengthening our psychological immune system and ensuring that that it's robust enough to handle this kind of new world that we're going to be living in.
I love that idea. I'm rereading one of the better science fiction books from my perspective, called The Fifth Science. And he's got a line in there called a narrative collapse. And he said, when a world becomes hyper connected, hyper networked, and everything that you see could be a fake, that everything collapses into a form of sameness. And it is incumbent upon you as the human being confronting this world to become curious, to dig, to become skeptical, if you will. So I think that is a really interesting use case. I'm a former quant, right? So I'm always building algorithms in my head. And one of the ones that I build is, I wonder if we could approach it in the Claude Shannon sense of information, right? So information is that which surprises you, right? So according to Shannon, a political speech would have zero information in it, right? Whereas a poem could have a great deal of information, because you can express it as a formula, which he did, which gave us cell phones and gave us this communication device that we are chatting over. But I actually think that that's a very interesting way to look at it. We have this sort of gap generation, of which I am a member, where a lot of people my age still default to belief. And I think it was Malcolm Gladwell who wrote a book about how we humans default to belief because it's societally and evolutionarily a really good thing to do, right? If we don't default to believing our fellow humans, you suddenly get a kind of a Mad Max environment, right? So
Yeah.
I think that it will be interesting, and the inoculation effect that you're talking about. Like I have 4 grandchildren, fifth on the way, and I suspect that they will be far more inoculated against this, tsunami of falsehoods
Yeah.
because of exposure. And I also think a bit about the idea of I've spoken to many people who came out of totalitarian systems, and literally that's what happened with them, right? There's even a joke about the old USSR, about the guy who goes to get bread and stands online for a long time and then says, "There's no bread here." And he's approached by the guys in the trench coats, and they're saying, "Comrade, don't you dare say that." And he says, "All right." And he goes back to his wife and she goes, "How are things?" And he goes, "Even worse than I thought." And she said, "Why?" And he goes, "Because they've run out of bullets." In other words, they would normally have killed me in the past for thinking this very, the emperor has no clothes, but now that they don't even have the bullets to kill me anymore, that's how kind of cynical they became. Which is, I think,
Yeah.
one of the interesting reasons why you see many of the former totalitarian countries embracing much more aggressive freedom, if you will. But
Mm.
on this topic, also, you have another piece where you call it an emotive conjunction. And it makes me think of loaded language and how our language can sometimes be misused. And I thought of the Bertrand Russell quote in which he says, I am firm, you are obstinate, he is a pig-headed fool." We're saying the same thing, right? But we're orienting it differently. The complexity of language, how do you think we're going to conquer that if AI is flooding the internet with all of this misinformation? And then we add the complications of language, especially English, but all languages really, to
Mm.
the mix.
Yeah, I think this presents a unique problem, I think, with language, because often you can tell whether something is biased by the use of qualitative terms, and superlatives and adjectives and all that kind of stuff. But with this Russell conjugation, the you could write a statement and not actually tell a lie, not tell a sort of something that could be fact checked, and still say something that's dishonest, or at least deceitful. And that's a very unique problem. It's a different order of deceit to just outright saying something that's false. It's more nuanced, and I do believe that AI would probably be able to capture this nuance eventually. I mean, I know that search engines do use this when they're determining how biased a sort of newspaper article is. For instance, they will check the emotive conjugation, but I don't know how AI would probably how it would react to it. I mean, I suppose it would probably use it in much the same way as humans are. I mean, if you were trying to get it to do something, it would probably resort to that, because it's obviously going to be a reflection of human behavior, isn't it? AI is going to be a reflection of human behavior. So it will essentially mimic the way that human beings use it. I think really the only defense against it is going to be for people to understand that it's actually a thing, that people can lie without actually explicitly telling a lie, that you can just from your choice of words, you can create a completely false picture in somebody's mind. And I think really the only, I think, solution to that is for people to, again, become acclimatized to it, to see that this is what happens and a good thing is that AI can be used to teach people this as well. You can get the AI to, for instance, write the exact same article, but use different conjugations. And in doing so, present different pictures, even though the two articles are essentially the same. The word choices would be pretty much the same, apart from just a few here and there. So, if you could, for instance, have in one article, you'd have steadfast, and then in the other, you'd have stubborn instead of steadfast. So it would create a completely different picture, but still the two articles would be next to near the same. So I do believe that AI will be used to teach people about these techniques. I think it will be able to teach people in a way that's far superior to human teachers, because it will be able to do this kind of thing, like generating two sets of articles, with these little changes, and so that you can compare them and contrast them. I do believe that that's probably going to be the best hope, just to teach people about it.
I agree, and I think that that kind of constant reinforcement, if you will, of but did you think about it this way? And I love your example. Here's the original article. Here are just a few different words being used. Do you feel the same about both of these articles? And people, I think, will react, at least if they read both and they consider both, they'll understand, wow, I had a very different reaction to the article where the words were just a few words got changed. So I think that that is one of the things that I'm certainly hopeful about in
I
terms of.
really do, because I think that is the main source of media bias. I do believe that it's something called poultering, where a journalist will be able to essentially deceive you without technically telling a lie, and they use this to go beyond, so that they can essentially feed you a narrative without sort of falling foul of fact checkers or any kind of regulator. It's very clever what they do, but essentially it's through word choice. That's how they manipulate people, rather than telling outright lies. So
Yeah,
I think if people learn that, it would be very, very useful.
I agree. And it also reminds me of what you said at the opening of our conversation about using tests to see how racist somebody is, how X somebody is. First off, as you mentioned, that they don't replicate, which I think is pretty important. If
Mm.
someone is making grandiose claims about the efficacy of something that it doesn't replicate, that's a problem, right?
Yep.
And so the other thing that I think about constantly is this idea of, and I love your theme of inuring people to these things. So, for example, back to racism for a minute. It has been used in when I was young. I'm 62. Okay, so I was born in 1960. When I was young, calling somebody a racist was like one of the worst things that you could imply or infer about somebody. And you had, because in my mind, you saw the Klan burning the crosses and all these horrible, horrible things, right? Now, with the amount of times that epitaph is hurled, like there was an article recently, "Coffee is racist," and it I started to laugh really because like if coffee is racist, then everything is racist and nothing
Yeah,
is racist, right?
absolutely. I think it should be news if something is not racist now, because everything is pretty much racist, so it's no longer news. Air conditioning is racist, everything's racist, so it should be news if something is not racist. But yeah, I completely understand your point. I too remember that racism was a much more serious and a much more specific word when I was young as well. And I think really one of the things that has happened is the word has just become completely devalued. Now, if somebody calls somebody a racist, you don't know whether they're planning the systematic genocide of non-Aryan peoples, or if they just dressed as a Cherokee for Halloween. You got, it could be anything in between those two things. So the word just doesn't have much stock anymore, I think, unfortunately. But it's one of the sort of issues, I think, is that when the New York Times, for instance, puts the word racist in a headline, it just makes people want to read it, and not just people on the left, also people on the right as well. Conservatives also want to read it because they want to mock it, and they will mock it on social media. I was talking about this with Chris Williamson recently. He's a great podcaster as well.
I know Chris
Basically, this
well.
idea that
He's a good friend.
yeah, he's brilliant. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. So there's this idea where basically the New York Times has massively increased. I think since 2012, the terms racist and sexist have increased like 400%. We were talking about this on his podcast, have increased 400%, but there hasn't been a concomitant rise in actual racism or sexism. And I think the reason for that is that the New York Times realized that by leveraging the word racist and sexist, they could actually just hugely expand their audience. And they have, because it's such a controversial topic that when people see it, the people on the left will probably read it and they'll be like, "Oh my God, we need to do something about this." And then the people on the right will see it and they'll want to mock it. I think the New York Times deliberately calls things like coffee racist or whatever because they know that people who don't normally read the New York Times are going to see it and they're going to want to mock it. Because I certainly get the urge to mock it when I see it. I get the urge all the time. And they'll post on social media saying, "Look, the New York Times has lost its mind." And in doing that, we share it. And so it's essentially, there's no such thing as bad publicity for them. They'll get people to share it, whether they're on the left or whether they're on the right. And obviously, people like Tucker Carlson will mock it on Fox News and he'll introduce that article to his audience and then they'll go online and talk about it. So it's like nowadays, there's a great writer called, what's his name? Scott Alexander. And he's got this idea called the Toxoplasma of Rage, which is that narratives that do the best in the digital age are not those that everybody thinks are true, but those that divide people the most. So those are the ones that spread the furthest. And the reason that that's the case is that by debating the idea, people spread it and make it go viral. Everybody wants to take part in that debate. Whether if something's just true, then it tends to just be forgotten. People see it, they nod, they agree with it, and then that's it. They forget about it. But if something invokes strong feelings for or against, then it creates a front in the culture war. And the culture war dominates social media at the moment. And so people, want to take a side and they want to signal their commitment to a certain tribe by arguing for that side. And so by turning an article into a kind of battleground, it just inflates the sort of impact of it. And it just basically goes viral and everybody wants a piece of it. So I think that that's a large reason for why you get articles like coffee is racist and things like that. I think that the people who write that stuff, I think they know that they're being absurd. I think they know it. I think some of them do anyway. Perhaps some of them don't, but I think some of them do definitely. And they do it because they know that people are going to react strongly to it.
Yeah, I agree on the intentionality. And again, I always try to put things in evolutionary biology, psychology, and why we do things the way we do them. And
Yeah.
I think that we are basically our operating system for humans is essentially an emotional one. And the ruling emotion is fear, and especially fear of novel fears, right? And again, that makes a great deal of sense evolutionarily speaking, because the world was a very, very dangerous place. And so the fact
Absolutely.
that we evolved to be fearful made a lot of sense. It makes much less sense now. And one of the things that concerns me is back to racism. Real racism, and you made the point eloquently, real racism is a horrible, toxic thing. And by debasing it, we are creating a perilous situation whereby if we lack the ability to distinguish between genocide and somebody's affinity for coffee, that's a really bad place to be. And so the ability to hijack human emotional systems it works. And it works because it's our ruling OS. And we're going to keep doing it until we degrade the ability, hopefully with the constant, assault of it. But where does that kind of leave us? Because you had another one that I love, which is the bandwidth tax. And you made the point that poor people, for example, who are economically poor, they have to devote so much cognitive energy to just figuring things out that they don't have a lot of cognitive calories left to look and understand other things. I think that that actually can also be extended greatly, right? So if you're a huge sports fan, you're using cognitive real estate for that. And I'm not saying that's bad or good. It's just a fact, right? You are using a lot of your cognitive calories to follow, football or whatever sport you love, or celebrity gossip, etc. That occupies those calories, and you can't reorient them if they're expended. So how how it's kind of like the George Costanza effect. I don't know if you're a Seinfeld fan, but George
Partially.
Costanza is kind of this loser, right? And who's always thinking about women and sex and everything. And he, in one of the episodes, decides he's going to give up sex, going to give up thinking about women, and of course, he immediately becomes a genius. um, how do you think? How do you think this plays out in this environment that we're discussing? With people's, we have bandwidth problems.
I think it's something that some people may be able to remedy with AI. I think going back to AI, I think one of the great things about AI is that it allows us to do monotonous things and sort of routine things very, very well. It's got that down on lock basically. So what people can do, I think, is that they can devote some of the, they can free up some of the bandwidth by delegating tasks to AI. I think this is something that should probably be taught to people from a very young age, how to delegate tasks to AI. And I think it will be, because that's going to be it will free up so much, not just time, but also cognitive bandwidth as well. And it will allow people to just focus on things that matter. So if people need to budget, for instance, budgeting can be done by AI. That's a very simple task. It can be done by AI quite well. I mean, you don't even need AI to do it, but I think AI will make it more attractive and more easier for most people. And it will allow people, I think, to focus on things that they really want to do and things that they're passionate about. I mean, there have been arguments that universal basic income could be a possible remedy to the bandwidth tax, because it will give people that baseline that they need to just not have to worry about whether they're going to be able to pay their next bill or whether they're going to be able to pay their rent on time or whatever, so that they will be able to free their mind up to think about other things and try to advance themselves as a person rather than trying to just scrape the barrel and just survive. I mean, I don't know. I'm still torn on universal basic income. I think there's great arguments for it. I think there's great arguments against it. But it's a possible solution to the bandwidth tax. I think personally, we're moving in a situation. We're moving towards this kind of trajectory now, where the ups and downs, the vicissitudes of life, have less of an impact on an individual, because though they can be dealt with by automation, many of the things that were responsible for a lot of our sort of our problems in the past, can now be remedied simply by automating them. So I think I'm quite positive, even though, like I said, I do believe that AI will fill up probably a lot of social media with even more misinformation. I think on the whole, it's going to be very good for people. I think it will allow people to just not have to worry about mundane things as much as they used to have to worry about them. Mundane tasks will take up less of the average person's life and free them to think more about the kinds of things that they really want to do in life. And, they can focus on their ambitions rather than just on surviving. So I think that is probably the best hope.
I agree. That's actually one of my main hypotheses about AI, is that it will allow for a flowering of human creativity because of the cognitive calories that are no longer being expended on cut and paste type activities that have, honestly, if you look at human history, occupied a great deal of our time and attention. It also is one of the reasons I changed my opinion on universal basic income. I used to be opposed to it primarily because most of the empirical tests that I had seen had some pretty serious problems. But I changed my opinion on it simply because in my opinion, we have to, and again, this is an opinion. This is not a fact. this is a hypothesis that we should test, in my opinion, because we have to. It's been around for a long period of time, and we now have a situation whereby we're moving from a society that was devoted to basically a Bayesian distribution pattern to a more Mandelbrot chaotic distribution pattern, which is much peakier in the middle and has very long tails. And so I think AI is going to be really amazing for this side of the tail. And I think it's going to be a real challenge for the other side of the tail. And I think the reason I changed my opinion on universal basic income is as cool as I think these innovations and tools are, we are really facing a situation where people who, through no fault of their own, that's very important, no fault of their own, are going to have to come up to speed. And it's going to be like older people, it's going to be hard. And, you already see the scammers are using AI to scam older people because they still believe that voice on the other end of the phone is an actual human being. And often it's not. It's an AI voice. The classic phishing techniques. And so sadly,
Absolutely.
the con artists and the scammers and grifters know how to take advantage of this very, very well. But I do think that you're correct in that if we can get into a situation where people, once they get up to speed on it, no longer have to devote their time and attention to pedestrian type tasks, that hopefully that will free up the ability to be more creative, to think more deeply about things, and then use the tools in that way, right? You have another one that I love, and I'm going to bring it in here because it just fits right now, is the idea of a golden hammer, which is intellectuals who get cult-like followings. They feed off of that cult-like following, and then they feel like, okay, I've got this golden hammer, I can hit every nail with it. And it doesn't matter if I got famous because I was a good quant investor. I'm going to now hold forth on, the democratization of whatever in Uganda, just to pick one randomly, right? And there is no way that I should be given the same attention on something I don't know anything about, really. And yet it's another of our human chunking systems. We chunk things together. And you make the point, I think, quite well, the curse of dimensionality, whereas the more detailed you make your data, it makes it less valuable. And one of the things that I love about that is, A, it's true, right? In like quants are really guilty of it. Well, this compounded historically at 14.31%. And, no, wait, what you should be saying is directionally, this is how this tends to behave. Now, lots of caveats, lots of ways that it doesn't behave. You should maybe take a look at all of those. But it's part of our human makeup, right? We suck at exponential functions. We can't grok them because, like, with your average human mind, it goes 1, 2, 3 a lot. and so
that's it. Yeah.
That
I think a lot of our problems are to do with the fact that we can't comprehend large numbers. Because I mean, for 300,000 years, we lived in small tribes, and we kind of only needed to count up to 10, really. We didn't really need to count any further than that in most cases. We certainly didn't need to count over 1,000 or anything, and it was really only recently that large numbers entered our lives. Really, it was mainly sort of in the 20th century that the very large numbers began to impact our lives, when astronomy started making huge leaps, and the microscopic world, and we started sort of globalizing, and soon we didn't have to worry about not just our tribe, but people on the other side of the world. Now we sort of have this kind of global village thing going on, where we have to comprehend billions of people at once when we're making decisions. And we're just not used to, our brains are just not made for that. And that's why we have all these sort of simplification, all these heuristics that we use now to sort of try and shrink the numbers down, which is the only way we can comprehend them. We can only comprehend them by, we might have to compare something to something else, for instance, use a metaphor to try and understand how big a number is. The classic, there are more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand on every beach on the earth. We have to use heuristics like that to try and grasp really big numbers. Essentially what we're doing is we're just using poetry there. But I mean, I do believe that this is responsible for a lot of problems that we have because we can't comprehend large numbers. When we go onto our feeds, for instance, and we're looking at events that are occurring, we look at sort of outliers. Your Twitter feed rarely shows you a conventional event, because if it's conventional, then it's not news. It's only news if it's an outlier. So we see these outliers, but because we can't compute the fact that there are millions of certain events going on and that we're only seeing the outliers, we can't comprehend the rarity of the event. And so it seems like it's just, this is how the world is to us. We see outliers and we think of them as conventional because we don't have anything to compare them to. We don't have the thousands of other events to compare them to that are conventional. And so we end up just sort of, getting completely deluded by these outliers.
And that bleeds through to so many different aspects of society and social organization. We were mentioning tribalism again. Evolutionarily speaking, you got to understand tribalism because it was a massive part of all of human history up until, just as you point out, the 20th century, really. And so our innate programming is one to tribe up. It is to, okay, I'm going to seek my tribe. And what do you do in tribalism? I think it was Will Storr, who has written extensively on this idea, who said, it's just part of our human nature. If you want to be part of a tribe, First off, what you want to do is fit in so that you're not exiled, because for most of human history, exile equaled death. And so you want to fit in, but then you want to stand out, which are two very conflicting desires.
Contradictory, yeah.
And very contradictory. And yet it does explain a great deal of human behavior. In terms of status seeking, in terms of all of the things. And you make this point many times in your threads and elsewhere that I love, which is the way I look at it is, are you thinking objectively or subjectively? I think that one of the big problems in the world and in communication is often formed by people not understanding whether they're being objective or subjective. I think there's a place for both. But if you are confusing your subjective opinion on something with a fact, and then you are attaching it to your sense of self-worth, well, then you're going to have a lot of problems. And if you are externally motivated or oriented versus internally oriented, you're going to do things very, very differently. And in terms of, like one of the things, I've been reading Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching since I was 18. And one of the things that he points out in there, and, it's not only Lao Tzu, it's Da Vinci, for example. The greatest deception man suffers from are their own opinions. And when you start thinking about, are you getting your opinions from other people? In other words, I think you reference Cooley and the looking glass self, where you're making your judgments based on what you perceive other people saying or thinking about you, which, by the way, you could be wrong. That's the other. There's so many ways for that to go wrong, and you get all of these compounding errors because you don't actually know what they think about you. You have an idea,
guessing,
right? You're guessing. And I thought of the Lao Tzu quote that, he who knows much may be learned, but understanding yourself, you're much more intelligent. If you have power over others, okay, that's great. But if you have self-control, you're much mightier. And then he finally ends it with, if you gain your happiness from others, you might be considered rich, but if you have self-contentment, you have inexhaustible wealth. So this idea of objective versus subjective, external versus internal, you seem to weave this into a lot of your threads. Talk a bit about that for a bit.
Yeah, so I think there's an important concept to add to that, which is intersubjectivity, which is when people form kind of conventions on what is true, and then they follow this. So it's a little bit more than subjective, but a little bit less than objective. So it's like an intermediate form of knowledge. And I think a lot of information, as you point out, is subjective. It's people trying to work out what other people believe. But then what happens when this occurs at scale is that we get intersubjectivity. So this is this takes the form of social norms, culture, things that are generally considered to be true by consensus, and we have all these sort of systems. And I think the majority of the truths that we have are essentially intersubjective. They're not quite objective, they're not quite subjective, but they're a little bit in between. And I think that this really harks back to our tribal past because, as you pointed out, people want to belong to a tribe, right? And one of the ways that people belong to a tribe is by having the same beliefs as the other members of that tribe. So we're kind of configured in a way not to believe what's true, but to believe what the people around us believe so that we can fit in. But then we also do have a capacity to essentially argue for that belief as well in a way that might be slightly unconventional, and that will help us to stand out, as you also point out we need to do. So we might argue for something more vigorously than other people, and that will allow the people around us to say, wow, this person really knows what he's talking about. He believes what we believe, but he's arguing it even better than we can. So then they can elevate you to a leader. So we're sort of, our minds are not trained to argue for what's true, but to argue for what we want to believe and what we need to believe in order to be part of the tribe that we want to be part of. And I think a lot of this is why, I wrote an article recently about why intelligent people believe stupid things. And I think a lot of that is really due to the fact that rationality is not just a tool for finding truth. It's also a tool for rationalizing and for convincing ourselves of things that we need to believe are true, even if they're not actually true, so that we can fit in. If you were if you were in the Khmer Rouge, for instance, and Pol Pot was, asking you what you believe, the people who said what they really thought would probably end up getting killed. But the people who could convince themselves that Pol Pot really was, the kind of messiah, essentially, who was going to fix everything and, bring everything back to year zero and completely equalize society and make sure that nobody ever was poor again. If you could convince yourself of that, then you had a much better chance of survival in that society. So, even though it's not true, even though it's a complete falsehood, if you could just convince yourself of it, you would more likely to survive. So there was a survival value in believing things that are not true. And so a lot of our mental hardware, a lot of our sort of rational hardware, our reasoning sort of capabilities have been configured to just convincing ourselves of things that are true. And I think we see this all the time online. We see it, people form these kind of echo chambers and they form these tribes on Twitter. And you see people just engaging in things that just are completely dishonest, perhaps not consciously dishonest, but subconsciously dishonest, where there are certain things like, confirmation bias, for instance, where people ignore information that doesn't fit their narrative and remember and focus on information that does. I don't think this is not something that people do consciously. Sometimes they may, that you may get bad faith actors doing it consciously, but generally it's an unconscious process. And this is one of the sort of problems of the human mind, is that it's not really configured for truth. It's configured for a kind of truth, vertical truth. Vertical truth is the truth that helps you to survive. But it's a social system. The brain is a social system that it tries to ingratiate humans into tribes and also to increase their status within that tribe. And this always, I think, whenever anybody is going to try to work out human, some kind of human behavior, make a prediction about human behavior, they need to begin from that premise. I think the fact that the human mind is not configured for objective truth; it's configured for intersubjective truth, and in some cases subjective truth. But it's I think we are at heart tribal creatures, and that needs to always be factored in whenever you're trying to make a prediction about human beings, because it's just much better than this kind of idea that humans are rational actors, and they kind of will always do the right thing if you give them enough time. But history has shown that that's not the case. So
yeah, I agree, and it's been a key part of the way I look at things for a long time. The idea that we and we've seen it explode with the and networking effect that we're seeing online, internet being the largest variance amplification system in human history. And so you suddenly are seeing a great deal of preference falsification. People, the whole idea of private knowledge versus public knowledge, and how quickly it switches when somebody says that the emperor is naked, and other people like start believing that. I enjoy the speculative philosopher Jed McKenna, who says crazy is a numbers game. And his conversant says, what do you mean? He goes, when somebody says something that's crazy, and then the person goes, it's not crazy, and he responds, if you can get enough people to believe it, not crazy anymore.
yeah.
So it's like, if you are designing a system, as you just eloquently outlined, where it's subjective, you're going to see all sorts of preference falsification. You're going to see cult-like behavior. Bringing up Pol Pot is quite interesting. I was in Cambodia and actually met one of the few survivors of his horrendous genocide. And literally, that's what his parents got him to do, was to learn to pretend that he didn't understand French and that he didn't need reading glasses, because glasses meant you were literate, meant you were dead. Because in Pol Pot's Cambodia, it was year zero, as I'm sure you're familiar with his attempt. And the one thing that just is troubling to me is that historically, at least, we see these death cults that have taken over societies. Stalin in the USSR, Pol Pot, Mao in China. And I look at all of these as emotional plagues that infect the minds of a society. And you see it everywhere. Like it happened here. You go all the way back to witch hunts, and then you say, well, that was crazy. Those people were idiots. Well, in the 1980s, a mind virus took over California that convinced a majority of people that their children were being molested in preschool situations. People went to jail. People committed suicide. None of it was true. So
yeah, I mean, it's like the panic and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. I mean, humans are prone to sort of moral hysterias, and I think one of the concepts in one of my megathreads, I can't remember which one it was. I've got this one called the purity spiral.
Yeah.
In fact, I'll read it. I'll read it out to you if I can just quickly get it. So it's so members of political tribes inevitably begin competing with their fellows to be the most ideologically pure. The constant one-upmanship toward moral superiority causes the whole group to gradually become more extreme. And then as examples, I've given Maoist China and Twitter echo chambers. So I think when you combine like a sort of a moral panic with a purity spiral, this usually results in a sort of a totalitarian movement, because everybody, like, as you pointed out, people want to excel within their tribe. They want to have higher status within their tribe, and they want to avoid dying as well. They want to avoid being executed. So it creates this kind of game of brinkmanship where everybody's trying to be more pure, be more morally pure by, denouncing the outsiders, denouncing scapegoats more than everybody else. So you see this happening in Stalin's Russia, where during the purges, for instance, you had people who would go out there and they'd call out other people to be, accusing them of traitors in order to make themselves less likely to be killed, because it's a signal to say, look, I'm loyal. I'm pointing out this disloyal person here. Don't kill me, kill this person here. And so this kind of purity spiral is, I think, it's like a kind of it has a runaway effect where everybody's trying to be more pure than everybody else, so they're all competing to be more morally pure, and it basically just lifts everybody up towards more and more authoritarianism. Everybody wants to be more communist than the next guy if they're living in a communist society. So if you're like somebody in North Korea, I mean, this is happening in North Korea. You want to respect the great leader more than everybody else, and so you'll be more enthusiastic and you'll do even more. But then other people are doing that as well. So everybody's now acting far more insane than they normally would. It's like a kind of contagion, except it's driven by competition rather than conformity. So it's a very interesting dynamic at play. But I think that purity spirals explain a lot of why movements become extreme over time. And also, I think it explains Twitter echo chambers to a certain extent as well, where people want to signal their commitment to the tribe and signal how pure they are. And in doing so, they make everybody want to compete with them who's also in the tribe. And then they also do the same thing. And everybody begins to just begin signaling like crazy in order to be more, seen as more sort of pure than everybody else. So, yeah, I mean, I think that explains a lot of it. Yeah.
I think you would enjoy Will Storr's The Status Game, because that is part of his central thesis in the book, is that it's part of our OS to want these things. It can be easily hijacked by bad actors. And your point about Twitter, I think, is bang on. And I am perhaps ill-advised, still optimistic about the chances for a global communication network actually being a good thing ultimately. But we need it to evolve, probably in the way you said earlier in our conversation, with this dump of massive amounts of disinformation. Younger people will probably be able to become inoculated against it, hopefully, and then combine it with the ability to think more creatively about it. But I wonder, we call the generation that fought World War I the lost generation, because so many men died in that war, which was a pointless and, well, all war is mostly pointless. However, but that one was particularly pointless. And the concept of a lost generation became quite popular among thinkers and writers and whatnot. Do you think we're facing a lost generation here?
I don't think so. No, I think I'm not sure in what sense it would be a lost generation. If you could clarify that for me.
Sure. The people who have not yet had the ability to tune in. Bucky Fuller had a great line, which is, don't get angry with people because they don't grok a particular subject. It might just be that they're just not yet tuned into it. And he used as an example the first microscope user. And he looked in the microscope and was like, holy shit, there's a whole different world down there. But it took like hundreds of years for the rest of society to understand that, because they weren't tuned in, because they didn't have that particular tool, the microscope, to see the microscopic world. And so my worry, and I'm not overly worried, I find it interesting to discuss, is whether the people trained on the old models, the old way of looking at the world, the default to honesty or the default to believing other people, etc., whether given this new environment in which we have pretty much made the case, I think successfully, although others may differ, but that there is so much misinformation now that these people aren't appropriately equipped cognitively to interact with that. And that's what I mean about the kind of lost generation.
I understand. Yeah. Okay. I don't think that there's going to be a lost generation. And the reason for this is that I think that people are quite adaptable. Even, no matter what age they are, I think people can adapt to information pretty quickly because we've evolved to do that. We've evolved to, live in rapidly changing environments. And I think that's one thing. And another thing is that I think people's families will help them out a little bit. So the younger generations will be able to help the older generations a little bit. So I help, my aunts and uncles and stuff. Sometimes if they're stuck on technology, I can help them out. And I'm sure that when I'm a bit older, then younger generations will help me out as well. So I think, by working together, I think we can sort of overcome any kind of potential lost generation effect. Combined with the fact that I think people probably don't need it anyway because we're all quite adaptable. So I think we should be all right.
I agree, and I'm happy to hear you give that answer. Because, well, it is something I do think about. I do share your more optimistic view that that the various generations working together can do that. One of the other things, though, that we are kind of programmed to like complex explanations as opposed to simple explanations, right? So Occam's razor, the principle of parsimony, I'm sure you're very familiar with it, which is generally speaking, the simpler solution that meets all of the criteria is correct. And yet there's a wonderful study that impacts the way people make repeated errors in thought. And it has to do with, Smith and Jones. And Smith and Jones are brought in as the subjects of a study, and they're told that their goal in this study is to look at a series of pictures of a human cell and to guess whether that human cell is healthy or sick. And what they aren't told is that only Smith is getting accurate feedback from the system. In other words, if he guesses that it's sick and it is sick, he gets a green light. If he guesses it is not sick and he's correct, he gets a green light. But if he gets the guess wrong, he gets a red light. Jones, on the other hand, is being given a green light or a red light based on Smith's guesses. Okay. So as one follows the research along, Smith, who's getting accurate feedback, is soon getting about 85% of his guesses right. Whereas Jones, it's still a flip of a coin. But here's what's fascinating and why I use this example quite a bit. When they're brought out, they're together. And they first turn to Smith, who's getting 85% of his guesses right, and say, well, how do you do it? And his answers are quite direct and quite simple. He says, well, I noticed that if it's got broken edges or if there's a discoloration, it's probably a sick cell. Otherwise, it's healthy. And a couple other real simple rule of thumbs, right? And then Jones, of course, not getting any right, he launches into this incredibly Baroque tapestry of words about how sometimes it's this way and sometimes it's that way, etc. But the payoff is, when asked who got more right, all of the Joneses who don't get any right, and almost all of the Smiths say Jones. Why? Because Jones's explanations are so much more elaborate, are so much more complicated. And I use it as an example of how the human mind is constructed to prefer actually that complex, or at least is now, that complex argument, when in fact it's Occam who's getting more of them right. What do you think about that?
That's very interesting. Yeah, I never heard of that study, but I think that kind of can be explained, I suppose, by the narrative fallacy to a certain extent, where we tend to prefer elaborate stories as explanations rather than systems and things. So I think because they're easier to kind of grok, we're storytelling beings, And I think perhaps, again, this goes back to our evolutionary history. The kinds of information we used to get from each other was traditionally told in the form of stories around the campfire or whatever, and so we've learned to glean information in the form of stories and to also think in story form. We tend to convert systems into stories. And I think what was happening here is there was a conflict between systems and stories. The guy who was getting his guesses correct more accurately, he was using a system. So he was finding the broken edges and blah, 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 and he was using that as a way to get to the truth, because the system is usually a better way to get truth. The other guy was using a story. He was creating this kind of, okay, well, this happened and then this happened and this happened and then this happened. And I think people have a more of an affinity to stories than they do to systems, which is why if you have a look at sort of pretty much any explanation nowadays, the only ones that tend to sort of go viral are ones that tell a good story. Whereas the ones that are accurate, the ones that are just written in system form or as a model, those tend to not get as much, sort of traction online, because people are just not compelled by systems and models. They're far more compelled by stories and narratives and stuff. So I think really just kind of sums up the way that we prefer information. We prefer it in narrative form. We kind of have to fictionalize information before it appeals to us, which is one of the kind of great paradoxes of the human mind.
I completely concur. And again, as a quantitative investor, I always favored systems and processes over narrative. And like I can get a great reaction out of market people by simply saying narrative follows price, not the other way around.
Yeah.
And people get quite angry with me when I say that, because of our innate preference for stories, right? Because it's kind of the way our OS works. And yet, you also have a great point in one of your mega threads that the more intelligent a person, the better the bullshit narrative they can build, because they convince first themselves, then after they've convinced themselves, they go out and they just tell a better story. I used to, when I was giving speeches about our way of investing, I used to say, I am going to tell you a series of stories about why you shouldn't listen to stories when making investment decisions. And yet it is so ingrained in what we do. And you make the point that people who are masters of debate, right, are drawn to things like law, politics, media, where theory is much more important generally than practice, right? And there was an old joke in my field, which is, well, we know it works in practice, but can we make it work in theory? And yet theory now is becoming much more dominant, primarily maybe because of this idea that everything is the narrative, and what do we pay attention to? The unusual, right? And so you got to be more and more provocative. Now, ultimately, that has a half-life, right? Like we were talking about racism, right? We have so taken the terror out of that word, and it should have a lot of terror in it, in my opinion, because
Absolutely.
of horrible things done in its name.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of what is happening with people calling things racist is this narrativization. You get clever people who will, you could choose a random object, like for instance, air conditioning, and then to try to make the case that that's racist is quite difficult, but it can be done. You can make the case that pretty much anything is racist, and I think a lot of people do this as a kind of exercise. When they're writing for the New York Times, like, can I make the case that air conditioning is racist? And then they will go on, and talk about how it fits the native temperature of Europe rather than of Africa, or and then you could just make up any nonsense about it. But that's essentially what's happening, is a narrativization. The way I look at it is, it's like the constellations in the sky. You have facts, which are like stars, and then you draw connections between them, like the ancient Greeks did in the night sky, where they would draw these lines between these dots in the sky and form shapes that comported with their mythology. So they would find Perseus in the sky, or Ariadne, or one of the other Greek gods or whatever. I think that's essentially what's happening with this kind of whole racism thing, is that people are getting isolated pieces of information like facts, and then they're constructing a narrative of racism by joining the dots in a certain way that comports with their mythology of, say the West as being inherently and irredeemably racist. And so essentially they're doing essentially the same thing as the ancient Greeks did with the night sky. They're finding these isolated facts. And I think that's one of the big problems with having so much information available at our fingertips, is that with enough imagination, you could cherry pick any stars, as it were, any facts, and you can construct almost any narrative you want just by joining them together in a certain way, which is really, I think this is responsible for so much of the false narratives and conspiracy theories and moral panics that we're subjected to in the information age.
I agree. And I think that, again, just making the point on the New York Times and how, when I was growing up, the New York Times was called its nickname was the Gray Lady. And it was the most authoritative source of so-called facts. And yet you could also solve for the New York Times by the simple approach of follow the money. Why did the New York Times do what it did? Well, they were maximizing for revenue. And if you're maximizing for revenue and Donald Trump gets elected in the United States, what are you going to do? You're going to do what the New York Times did. You are going to go, you know what? If we're going to maximize revenue, we're going to become Pravda here. And we are going to be the not loyal opposition. And we are going to be inflammatory, and we are going to just outright say shit to get people worked up. And yet, like most people say, that's awful, that's horrible. Well, yeah, it is. But if you're thinking about the problem as I'm the head of the New York Times, I'm responsible for maximizing shareholder value. How am I going to do that? I'm going to do it by maximizing revenue. To maximize revenue, I'm going to inflame people, and then they're going to want to join my tribe because they want their own confirmation bias, right? And I'm not just picking on the Times here. Fox News does exactly the same thing. And so it's like, of course they're going to maximize on those if that's what they want, maximize, not truth, not understanding, not nuance, but rather revenue. Well, of course, you're going to maximize for things that inflame somebody. And then you add to the problem the thing you rightly point out, which is the smarter you are, the better the seeming steel man you're going to build based off these disparate things that you're just picking out of the air, right? That's how a lot of these belief systems get going, right? And, then you get distribution. I used to joke, why did we have 1,000 years of darkness after the fall of Rome? Because the Catholic Church had a better distribution network than everybody else. And because on top of that, they had really great memes in the Dawkins sense of memes, not the memes we see on Twitter, but these ideas that transfer between human minds quite easily, right? And so I think that the idea that your solution is kind of curiosity and humility, which I completely embrace, because listen, the market has humbled me so often that if you're still doing anything in the market and you're my age, just by your very nature, you've got to be humble in the face of it, because it is such a humiliating thing for people who I think I'm right. No, actually you're not. If you listen to Mr. Market and the market says you're wrong, ultimately, well, then you would make the case, but I'm only wrong in the short term. I'll be ultimately right. No, if you're wrong and you put your money and it has an expiration date and it goes to zero, you were wrong. Now, you could be right in the future with a similar argument, but the idea of marrying curiosity and humility is one that really intrigues me. Talk a little bit more about how you would inculcate that more in people.
Yeah. So, I mean, the way I see it is that certainty is the death of thought.
Totally.
So, yeah, so the moment you become certain about something, you stop thinking about it. You don't grow anymore. You're basically putting a dead end on your learning. And so I think it's helpful to always have that little amount of uncertainty about everything, and to know that you don't know everything about that thing. To just that awareness alone, I think, can really, really help with both curiosity and humility. And I think another good way to increase curiosity in particular is through this thing called the curiosity zone, which is a kind of mental model, which I found on the internet, which I think is very helpful, which is you basically learn as much as you can about as much as you can. Or not necessarily as much as you can, but you just learn as little, even as little as you can about as much as you can. You just learn a little bit about a lot. And by doing that, you create these kinds of signposts in your mind that you want to hang things on, that you want to learn more about. You want to, if you learn a little bit about, for instance, terraforming, for instance, just take some random, if you just perchance just read about that, then that will create thoughts in your mind, which will make you want to read more about it at a later date, because you'll generate questions from learning that little bit about it. You'll generate new questions, and those new questions will itch at you until you want to scratch them by learning more. And so it's by learning a little bit at a time, you grow. You don't, like, people don't, like, curiosity is not the desire to fill your head with knowledge. It's the desire to fill gaps in your knowledge. So if you can create those gaps by having little bits of information, then you'll want to fill those gaps in by sort of being curious and learning new things. And so that's a good way to learn new things. It's quite a strange phenomenon, but the more that you learn, the more that you want to learn. So it's something that, if you can start off and just start learning slowly, that will create these new questions. You'll want to learn more, and then you gradually fill out your mind with information. And I think that curiosity and humility go hand in hand. I think that they help each other. That when you're sort of humble, that makes you curious, because the humility makes you realize that you don't know as much as you might have thought you would. And so that spurs you on to learn more. And likewise, being curious makes you humble as well, because you feel like if you're kind of, when you learn, you realize how little you know again, so it's kind of like a symbiosis between curiosity and humility. The more humble you are, the more curious you will be, and the more curious you are, the more humble you will be generally. So I think that it's a good thing to practice sort of both at the same time, to sort of maximize this symbiosis and ensure both of them sort of, hit the ground running. So yeah, I think, because I've seen plenty of intelligent people just completely get things wrong, and I often use the example of Taleb, Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He's a brilliant man, very intelligent, and I love his books. But when you see him on Twitter and you see the certainty with which he makes pronouncements, he gets things wrong a lot. And the reason he gets them wrong is because he has no humility, and he doesn't appear to have much curiosity. I mean, he might have curiosity, I don't know, but he certainly doesn't have humility. He's very, very certain about everything he believes. He will usually insult people who disagree with him. And he's just very, very sort of abrasive, and sort of, he turns a lot of people off him, I think, by doing that. But I think it's because of that he gets things wrong. But I think if he was less certain about his beliefs, I think he would be far more intelligent even than he already is. And I do, like I said, I do think he's an intelligent man. I just think he would be even more intelligent if he was more humble. So I think if you try to be intelligent, that usually leads to stupidity.
Yes.
But if you try to be humble and curious, that leads to intelligence.
Yes.
So
and wisdom.
That's the way.
And a writer who I think you would love his name's Robert Anton Wilson. He was 50 years ahead of his time.
Right.
And he has this great quote, which is, if you think even briefly that you're just a cosmic schmuck, that makes you briefly less of a cosmic schmuck.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Because I completely agree that certainty is brain death, in my opinion. That like, and I don't mean it, the pedantic would come in and say, whoa, are you not certain the sun isn't going to come up tomorrow? And like, okay, I think it has a super high probability of happening, so I don't concern myself with it, right? The probabilities are so overwhelmingly in its favor that it's not something I have to worry about every time I go to bed at night. But the fact is, if you can frame things more as a continuum, more as a, well, what the probabilities would suggest would be, this, and try to frame it that way, you're going to become wiser. You're going to become in it, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? The more you're willing to admit, I don't know, like, but again, who are people attracted to? They're attracted to people who speak with certainty. They're attracted to, I can tell you these simple truths, which of course aren't truths at all. They are opinions for the most part, but it's really interesting to me because it just seems like a feature, not a bug in our OS, right? And so my friend Tim Urban has a new book out called "What's Our Problem?" A self-help book for societies, and he shares your idea of I think he calls it a thinking ladder, right? And at the bottom rungs of the thinking ladder are tribalism, are flat Earth societies, are Heaven's Gate cults, are all of the conspiracy theories that are so popular on social media. And one of his ideas is, can we have a space where people can just agree that they don't know, that they will have conversations about these things that will be ongoing. It's something that we're exploring with O'Shaughnessy Ventures with our Discord. And it's interesting because I believe that the way you generate better knowledge and better innovations is to have a great deal of cognitive diversity, and let it work, against
Absolutely,
first, but then with, and then building. So I think that it's really interesting, and things like your mega threads. One of the things that makes me really happy is how popular they are, because like,
yeah.
essentially I'm like, I love the fact that he had this many
There's an
views
appetite
and
for
this
it.
many likes for those kinds of ideas.
Yeah,
What's next for you? Are you gonna? Because I was thinking, boy, I'd love to publish. You could publish just a great book, filled with all.
yeah. Well, I'm working on one. Yeah, I'm
Oh,
working on
excellent!
one at the moment. So that's it's still quite a long ways off yet, but I'm quite hopeful that it's going to be something that a lot of people will enjoy. And I think if you like the mega threads, then you're going to love this because it's going to be
Fantastic.
something on a new scale. Yeah,
Well, I'm looking at our time here, and I have the tendency to go on. And I've only covered about half, so I would love it if you'd come back at some point.
yeah.
Because
I'd love to.
this has been super fun. I love your
Yeah,
work. And we close off all of our podcasts with the following question, and that is, we're going to wave a magic wand, and we're going to make you the emperor of the world for one day. You can't be like Pol Pot and want to kill everybody, nor can you send anyone to a re-education camp. But what you can do is, we're going to hand you a magic microphone, and you can speak two things into it, and those two things will be incepted in the world's entire 8 billion pop plus or minus several million population. And everybody, whenever their tomorrow is going to wake up and think, I just had the two greatest thoughts and I'm going to pursue them. What are you going to incept in the world's population?
be humble and be curious.
Boom. I love it.
Nice and simple.
Nice and simple. And if we can incept that, we're gonna have, what's the meme that shows the futuristic world? Like, life without lawyers, life this has been
Yeah.
terrifically fun. Thank you for coming on. And
Thank you for having me.
can't wait to have you on again to talk about the other half of the stuff that we didn't even get to.
Absolutely. Yeah. It'd be my pleasure. Yeah. Been
Cheers.
lovely chatting with you. Yeah. Thanks a lot.